I'll just introduce myself here. So I'm Zach Taylor. I grew up in Utah, got my bachelor's degree a few years ago in math, but I also took a lot of computer science classes in college, and then that kind of led me to web development. So I moved to Chicago a couple of years ago, where I started my first job as a web developer for Chicago Venture Partners. And basically we build websites for their portfolio companies. We also build web-based sales tools that are used internally by one of their main companies called Typenex Medical. So that's a little introduction to me. So I guess we'll just jump into things here. So here's kind of a roadmap for what I'm going to talk about today. First thing is custom hooks. I just kind of want to give an introduction to custom hooks and talk about, why they're useful, how they can improve your apps. And then kind of the main topic I want to get into is React Query, which is a library for managing server state in your applications. And then at the end, I'm going to go back and kind of show how custom hooks combined with React Query can improve things even more. So that is basic. So we'll just get started with custom hooks. Here's a little scenario here. Tell me if this sounds familiar. You have a function that does some task, and it takes some input, returns a value, and does a few things along the way. So, thing one, thing two, thing three here. It's a pretty common scenario, but a couple things could happen with this function. So maybe eventually you start adding a lot of things to this task, and this function gets really long. And, that can become kind of confusing. It's hard to understand, what's going on when it's a really long function. It becomes, harder to read. It's not as clear. And another thing is, maybe one of these little subtasks like thing two here, maybe you decide you need to do that elsewhere in your code. And so, but, right now it's kind of coupled with this encompassing task function. So, what do we typically do to solve this? Well, we split it up into more functions. So you can take each of those subtasks in here, and you can split them out into their own functions, where, each one takes care of one of those things in here. And so, what do we gain from doing things this way? Well, the first thing that we gain is clarity. So, the nice thing about functions is they allow you to give a name to a specific task. So, instead of just a bunch of code that does thing one, you can actually give it a name and say, we're doing thing one right here, which makes, it makes these subtasks a lot more clear, and it also makes this overarching one more clear, what's actually going on. You also gain focus from doing this, and what I mean by focus is basically single responsibility principle. So each of these functions has one thing that is focused on, and it can just focus on that one thing. You also gain reusability. So if you decide you need to do thing two somewhere else, it's easy to just import that function and call it where you need it. If you want to, go a step further, you could take thing two and you could publish it to NPM, and other people could download it and use it in their code. So you gain a lot of reusability out of this. And then the last thing is testability. So it's easier to test, these smaller, more focused functions than it is to test the one big one. So, that should be all pretty familiar to you, pretty basic scenario, but how does this apply to React code specifically? React is based all around components, and components are just functions. They're functions that take props, and then they return a React element, which React will render to the screen. And we typically, render the React element with JSX down here. And then along the way, your component might do several things. It might use some state and create some state, or it might pull in some context from a component higher up in the tree, or it might run some side effects based on the state that it's in. And so, the same things can happen with your components. It might, your component might get really long, and all of this kind of intermediary stuff starts distracting from the component's main purpose, which is to return React elements. Or maybe you decide you need to use some of this state and side effects somewhere else in your code. And so the solution to this is the same as it is with regular functions. You can just split up those things into their own functions. So we can put the context in its own function. We can put the state and side effects in another function. And these functions that start with use in React are called custom hooks. And they're called custom hooks because they start with use and they call functions in the React library that start with use. But they're really just functions. And because they're just functions, you gain, you gain all the same things that you gain from the same situation and with regular functions. You gain clarity, like I said before, being able to name different parts of the algorithm here makes it a lot more clear what this component is actually doing. You gain focus by splitting out these subtasks into their own functions. Reusability, which is a big thing with React, or with custom hooks in React. You can reuse these hooks all over your application, or you can publish them and let other people download them and use them in their apps. And testability. So you can, instead of testing the whole component, you can just test these, or in addition to, you can test these, subtasks individually. And this example here on my slide is a little bit contrived. So I wanted to, just to make this a little bit more clear, show an example I have over here that's a little more practical. So just, hopefully help get the idea across a little better. So right here, we just, hypothetical scenario, maybe you have a PDF component that needs to render or generate a PDF and render it in an iframe. So you have this function up here that generates the PDF, and then down here, we've got a reducer where we just keep track of the state that the PDF generation process is in. We've got our effect down here where we, set the loading and error states of the PDF, and where we actually generate the PDF and all that. And then down here, we have the part where we return something for React to render. And so this is fine. I mean, this works, but the problem with this is that it's not, at first glance on this component, it's not totally clear what's going on. I mean, these names use reducer, use effect, they're pretty generic, and it's not, it's not immediately clear what they're for. So one thing that we're doing here is we've kind of got this whole, async process where we're going into a loading state, then, success and error states. And so that would probably be useful to extract into its own function so that we could reuse it elsewhere. So I've got this second slide here where I've extracted all of that into a custom hook that I've called use async. And I've just taken that code that we previously had in the component and moved it up here. So we have our reducer where we keep track of the states. And then down here, instead of running an effect, we just return this, or we create this function that takes care of, setting the loading error success states and doing all that once the promise is finished. And then we just return all of this. So then down here in our component, now that we've kind of abstracted all of that into a separate function, we can just call useAsync down here. And then we can just call that run function in our effect, passing it the PDF generation. And then down here, same thing, we just return what needs to be rendered. And already this is, a lot more clear what's going on. We know that we're doing something asynchronous. We know that we're running an effect. But this, this could actually be even a little bit more clear because this effect name is still pretty generic. It's not, totally clear what effect are we running. And so we can actually take this a step further. So here in this third slide, I have the same useAsync hook, but now I've extracted the call to useAsync and the effect into yet another function called usePDF that takes the contents, returns the PDF. And then, so down here now in our component, we've reduced all of that logic before to just one line here in the component. Use PDF, we pass it the contents, we get the PDF. And then, we still have our rendering down here. And so hopefully you can see the benefit of this. It's just, it makes your component it makes it a lot more clear what's actually going on, because now all that logic has this specific name where, it's clear we're generating a PDF and we're rendering different things based on what state the PDF is in. So hopefully that kind of helps you get the idea of our custom hooks and why, building custom hooks in your apps is so useful and why you should probably be doing it often. So I think that's all I wanted to say for custom hooks in this talk. So now I kind of want to move on to the main thing here, which is React Query. And like I mentioned at the beginning, let's see, I'm seeing some questions down here in the chat. Maybe I should answer these right now. So first question, does the use effect hook still run even after you extracted the logic into use PDF? Yes, it does. So when you call a custom hook, it just runs everything that's in this function. So it's as if you had the use effect in your component. You've just kind of moved it to a different place. So yes, it still gets run when you call this hook. Can we use a custom hook function from middleware like Saga function? I'm not totally sure what Saga is, so I'm not exactly sure how to answer that. Sorry about that. I don't think I see any more questions
No,
here.
I don't think you can.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so moving on here. Let's see, where was I? So React Query. So React Query is, like I said in the beginning, React Query is a library for managing server state in your application. So to kind of get into this, I wanted to first talk about state management in React. So when you think about state management, there are probably a lot of things that come to mind. Probably the most obvious one is React itself. So React comes with state management tools like use state, use reducer. Another popular one is Redux or MobX. I've never actually used MobX, but I've heard it's kind of similar to Redux. Xstate's another one that I've heard of for building state machines. And these are all great libraries and great tools. And the thing they all have in common is that they're really good at managing client state in your applications. And by client state, I mean, things that are only on the client. So those are things like, is this modal open? Has this button been clicked? Things like that. But these tools as great as they are for client state, they are not as good for, or out of the box, they're not as good for managing server state in your applications. And so I kind of just want to talk about the difference here between client state and server state. So like I said, client state is anything on your UI that your app creates itself. But then server state is pretty different. First of all, server state is always going to require use of asynchronous APIs because you're fetching things on the server. Client state might sometimes, kind of like with the PDF example, but server state is always going to require asynchronous APIs. Server state is persisted remotely, which is a pretty big contrast to client state. Client state is only stored on your client, but server state is stored on a server somewhere, right? And so you can't just change server state on your client without making an identical change on the server, because you need to make sure that they're in sync. That's a pretty big issue. It also, because it's persisted remotely, it implies shared ownership. So your instance of the client doesn't own this data, right? It didn't create it. And so conceivably someone could go along in another instance of your app or in the database, and they could add things or delete things or change things without your knowledge. And so how do you make sure that your client is up to date with all of that? That's a really common issue with server state. And another thing, because it's persisted remotely, it could potentially become unavailable if if the network connection is down or the server goes down for whatever reason. You need to make sure that you handle these situations. And it can also pretty easily become a performance issue if you're not careful. And this is because you might need to use some server state in several parts of your application. So maybe, for example, you need a list of to-dos in a couple different places. And, naively, you could just, make the fetch for that data in each of those components, but then that means that you're fetching this data several times when you don't really need to. And so I think this is one of the reasons that a lot of people use Redux for managing server state, is because Redux is a global store. And so you can just fetch things once in Redux, and then you can just, cache the result in the Redux store. That way you only fetch it once, it's stored once, and then all your components have access to it. And, that's awesome. But like I said, Redux, you kind of have to do some things to it to enable it to work this way with, asynchronous APIs and all that. It's not really, the main focus of Redux, but it is the main focus of React Query, and React Query is a great tool for managing this type of state, this server state in your apps. And, rather than go through some slides on this, I built a little small basic demo here that we're going to take this application from just using regular React APIs to using React Query. And hopefully this will help you get an idea of why React Query is a great tool to use for managing server state, and help you understand how it solves all these problems that we just talked about. So I'll just get right into the demo here. So here's this little app I've built. It's really simple. All it is just a form over here to create people, so you can give it a name and phone number, and then over here you have the list of people that you stored, and these are all stored in a database. And then you can click on a person and you can see their name and phone number. You have this option to delete that person. Let's see, just to give it, just to show how this works. So you type in the name and phone number, click create, see that little spinner on the button, and then, it gets added over here. So this is really simple, kind of contrived, but I think it's enough to understand the principles behind React Query and why it's useful. So just a couple things I want to point out here. So you'll notice that every time we change pages, we see this initial loading state. So, when I come to this page, you see it loads all the people. When you come to an individual person, it loads the person. And this kind of happens every time. So not an ideal user experience that everything is loading every time. And then one other issue with this is, like we talked about, because all of this data is persisted in a remote location, it could be changed without our knowledge. So for example, I actually have the database up over here. So I'm just gonna directly go into the database and delete that person I just created, Bob. And you'll notice that our client is completely unaware of what happened, because it's not making checks for that. So Bob still shows up here even though he's actually been deleted. So if I try to click on him, it's gonna show nothing, and this could confuse the user. Why doesn't this person show up? It's only when you come back to the home and refetch that you see the updated list. So just a couple things I wanted to point out, a couple of issues with the way this is currently implemented. So now I want to come over to, now that you've seen how the app works, I just want to come over here to the code and just kind of go through how this is currently implemented right now. So this is the home page. The home page just renders that count of people that you see at the top there. Maybe I didn't point that out. Right here shows how many people are there. And then, renders the form and renders the list of people. And then up here, we have all of this state and effects to accomplish this. So we have our list of people here, stored just in some state, kind of some placeholder data where I just put the name as loading. We've got an error that we're storing. We've got our fetch function here that takes care of setting the data in the error. We've got our effect that runs that just fetches the people initially on mount. And this could definitely be improved. This is a pretty naive implementation, but that's how things are working right now. So, and then coming over here to want to show these components. So right now we're currently passing our list of people down and our error down, and then we're passing this fetch function down to the form. And this is just so that we don't fetch this data in more places than we need to, kind of what I talked about previously. So then over here in our components, we've got that list of people that takes the people and error, returns an error if there's an error, and then if there's not, we just return the list of people down here. Then in the count, kind of the same thing. If there's an error, we show that. If not, we just show how many people are in the list. And then up here is the form for submitting or creating a new person. So here's where this is where I keep track of the form data. I've actually extracted this to a custom hook. But then down here is the loading and error states of creating a person. So when you click submit, we check if the form's valid, and then we kind of have all of this stuff going on where we make sure we set the loading and error states, and then we make our call to the back end to create the new person, and setting all the states accordingly. And then last thing I wanted to show was just that person detail page. And there's actually a lot of stuff going on this page. Even though the page is super basic, it just shows the person's information and it has a delete button. There's a lot of stuff that that needs to be taken care of for that. So you have the person data, you have a place to store the error for the person. You have, and then, with the delete button, we're storing the loading and error states of the delete process. We have this effect that fetches the person when this component's mounted. And then we have our delete down here, which takes care of deleting the person and setting the loading and error states as well. And if it's successful, we reroute them back to the home page. So, and then down here in the markup, we've finally gotten to that part of the component. And, just rendering errors if there are errors, rendering spinners if it's loading, and then just displaying the person's information. So that is how things are working right now. And so now I want to start converting this to React Query. So React Query is really easy to set up. All it takes is you just have to come in. So I'm using Next.js, but you can do this in whatever framework you're using. You just have to wrap the base component with what React Query calls the query client provider. So query client provider up there. And then you also need to create what's called the query client. So this is the entry point to React Query, and it's where all of your queries are going to get stored. And we'll see what this means a little bit later. So you pass to the provider, you pass your query client right there. And then React Query also comes with dedicated dev tools, which is awesome. So dev tools, that, and then we will that here. This parameter is just to make sure that it doesn't open up when you first load the app. So that is all it takes to set up React Query. It's really simple. You just give it the provider with the query client, and then put in the dev tools. So if we come back over here to our app, everything still works the same, but now we have the query client, there in the background, and then we have our dev tools down here. So now we can come over here to the home component and start using React Query. So the entry point to React Query is a custom hook that they provide called use query. So we'll import that. And the first thing that you pass to use query is what's called the query key. And the query key is just a unique identifier for this data that you're fetching. So it can be anything as long as it's serializable. So that means, it can be a string, it can be an array, it can be an array of objects, anything that's serializable and unique to the data that you're fetching. So we're just fetching a list of people here. So I'll just pass the word people as the query key. The second thing you pass to use query is a function that actually fetches the data. So I will just copy this fetch up here, and that's all you need to do there. And then the third parameter here is an object of options for the query. And React Query has a lot of options that you can use to configure it with. And we won't go over all of them today. There's a lot, but we will definitely touch on most of the they're the most commonly used ones. So one of those is placeholder data. So right here, you can pass it some placeholder data, which gets returned while the query is in its initial loading state, kind of like we're doing here. And then useQuery returns an object that has a lot of attributes on it. Just to show you, I happen to have the docs open over here. So there's a lot of stuff that gets returned from useQuery. You know, it returns the data, it returns the error. It also returns, you know, loading and error state Booleans here for, you know, so you can determine what state the query is in. All of that is taken care of just by this one call to useQuery. So if we come back over here to this code, useQuery takes care of, you know, storing the data, so we can get rid of that. It actually gets rid of storing the error too, so we can get rid of both of those. It takes care of doing the fetch and setting all of the, you know, loading and error states. And it actually takes care of the effect too. So when you call useQuery, it automatically gets run and this data gets fetched. So we can get rid of that. So all of that work that we did is replaced with just one call to useQuery, which is pretty awesome. And then we do have to make a small change down here. So the data that gets returned by your function here is placed on the data attribute of people. So, and then same with the error. So we'll pass people.error there. People.error there. And then we have lost our fetch function, but useQuery also returns a function that you can use to refetch the data manually if you need to. So people.refetch is what that's called. So that's all it takes to start using React Query. And this actually takes care of so many of the pain points of working with server state for you. Just this couple of lines of code here. If we come over here and start looking in our, if we look at our app again, you'll see that when we first loaded the app, you saw that initial loading state. So that's the placeholder data that's being shown, the loading. And then, you know, once the query has been loaded, we see all of our data here. And down here in the dev tools, you can actually see all the queries that are currently mounted on the screen. So, or that are currently in the store. So here's our people query, and you know, this is the query key that we passed. And then over here, you can see all of the data associated with that query. So here's the data that's being shown here. And then every query has these states that it can be in, and we'll talk about these states a little bit more as we go along here. But queries by default are immediately marked as stale, which I'll get into here in a second. But so the first thing I want to point out here is if you click on a person here and then you come back, you'll notice that there's no loading state, right? And that's because React Query will, when a new instance of your query is mounted on the screen, it will grab that data from the cache. So any query that you use is stored in React Query's cache. That's what the query client provider was that we set up at the beginning. So this data is all stored in the cache here, and you'll notice that when we leave the page, that query is inactive, but it's still there, right? It's still stored in the cache. So that means that when we come back here, React Query can immediately return that data. And so you don't get that loading state, you just get what's there in the cache immediately, which is makes for a great user experience. And then there's another thing that's really cool that I want to point out. So when you leave and you come back, the data is fetched immediately, or the data is grabbed immediately from the cache. But because this query is marked as stale, you'll notice that it also, for a split second, goes into the fetching state and then comes right back to stale. So just so you can see that again. Goes into fetching and then back to stale. So what React Query is doing here is when you mount this query, it sees, oh, this is already in the cache. So it grabs the data from the cache, and then in the background, it refetches. And so, so it'll refetch that data and then update it if the data has been updated, which is awesome. I mean, that just takes care of a lot of issues with keeping things up to date with the server, just right there. So so there's a couple of conditions when it will go into that refetching state. So the first one that I was just talking about is when the query gets mounted. So that's what's happening right here. The query gets mounted on the screen, so it triggers a background refetch. There's also a couple other conditions on which a background refetch will be triggered. One of them is if your network connection gets interrupted, then it will, and then once you come back online, it will trigger a refetch. Another one is if you leave the tab and then come back to it, you'll see that the fetch it refetches. So on window focus is when it does that. And then you can also actually set up a refetch interval. So if you decide that this data is kind of volatile and needs to be updated really often, you can set a custom refetch interval. So just to show you that over here, you can pass this refetch interval and you just pass it in milliseconds. So every 3 seconds, we'll see that this data gets refetched. Which is great for data that needs to be kept up to date, often. This data is not like that, so I'll just get rid of that, but that capability is there if you need it. One other thing to point out is that this really helps with keeping your stuff up to date with the server. So like I did before, if I were to come over here directly to the database, someone comes in and deletes something without my knowledge. Well, because of that on window focus refetch, as soon as we come back here, you'll notice that it gets refetched and the data is updated immediately. And all of that just for this one call to use query, which is awesome. So now that we've kind of talked about.
Can you abort the refetching if you decide?
Yes. Yeah, I think you can. You can abort the refetch. I haven't actually personally used that capability, but I am pretty sure that that is something you can do. So might want to take a look at the docs, but I've definitely heard that that's something you can do with this. So I think that's a yes. Big paginated data sets. Yeah, so that's also something I haven't personally worked with a ton, but React Query does actually have hooks for paginated data. So, and it makes it really, from what I've seen, it makes it pretty easy to work with pagination in your data sets. So yeah, definitely take a look through the documentation on that topic as well, because yeah, that is something it can do. Kind of moving on here, I wanted to also kind of do the same thing here with the person detail page, because there's a couple other things about the query, use query that I wanted to point out over here. So we'll just go ahead, use query. And like I said before, your query key needs to be unique to the data that you're fetching. So in this case, we're fetching a person and that person has an ID. So we want to make sure the query key is unique to that. And then down here, we'll pass in our fetch function, placeholder data as well. So let me just grab this here. And then that allows us to get rid of this and get rid of our use effect here. This error. And then, of course, down here, we need to change this to data. So, person.error.message. Data. I think that is a person. Oh, yeah, one other thing is, I pointed out those Booleans here, so you can check is error. Check that right there. So it provides some Booleans to check the error state. I'm seeing a message in the chat down here. Is the demo source code publicly available? It's not right now, but if you're interested, I could definitely post this. I'm not sure where I'd put the link to it. Maybe we can figure that out at the end or something. So I'll keep that in mind. Okay, so replace the person query. So if we come over here, we'll see that when we come to individual person, we see our new query down here show up. And so one more thing I wanted to point out with queries is we haven't talked about this fresh state yet. So by default, out of the box, all queries are marked as stale immediately. And like I said, stale queries are automatically refetched in the background based on those conditions that we talked about. But if you're pretty sure that a query's data isn't going to change very much, you can mark it as fresh, or you can set a certain time period for how long it should be considered fresh data. So I'm over here in this object of options here. There's a parameter called stale time, and you can set that to a certain number of milliseconds. So I'll set it to 10 seconds here. And so you'll notice that with stale time set to 10 seconds, this query is marked as fresh when you first grab it. And then after 10 seconds, it'll be moved over to the stale category. And so the difference between fresh and stale queries is that a fresh query will not be refetched in the background when it's mounted, because you've told React Query, hey, this data probably didn't change since the last time we fetched it, so you don't need to trigger a background refetch, which can be really good for optimizing this and making sure that you're not doing more things than you need to. So name and phone number probably won't change very much, so I'll actually change this to 5 minutes here. So then these queries will be marked as fresh for 5 minutes. So, the other thing that we haven't really talked about is this inactive state. So you'll notice that queries that are not currently being displayed on the screen anywhere are marked as inactive. And so when a query is inactive, it's still stored in the cache, but as soon as a query gets marked as inactive, a timer is started to determine when this query should be permanently deleted from the cache. So, and you can set this with a parameter called cache time. So if I were to set this to 5 seconds, I'm going to refresh the app here. But if I were to set that to 5 seconds, you'll notice that I come into this person and then I leave. So because I've set that as 5 second cache time, it gets automatically garbage collected after 5 seconds. So, so you're not, storing more things in the cache than actually need to be there. So that's another really useful tool for, optimizing the way that this works. So Let me look at my notes here. I think that's it for queries. That's, basic introduction to the use query hook, and it's incredibly useful with just a small amount of code, which is awesome. The next thing that I wanted to get into here is kind of another thing that React Query does, which is called mutations. So, typically when you're working with server data, you need to query data, but you also need to update data on the server, right? So in React Query, an update to the server is called a mutation. And so here in our form where we create a new person, we are doing a mutation. So we send data to the backend to create a new person. And so I want to show you how this can be done with React Query's mutations. So kind of like the queries, the entry point to this is a custom hook called useMutation. And the first parameter to useMutation is a function that performs the mutation. And so this mutation function takes an object of variables. So we'll just put a variable on there called data, and then come over here, grab our function that creates the person, and we'll just pass the data to our backend. And then, so that's the first parameter, is just this function. And then the second thing you pass to useMutation is basically an object of side effect function. So there's a function for each state of the mutation. So for example, on success. So when the data has been, or when the mutation has been successful, this on success is going to be called, and that is where we're going to want to do these things. So we set the blank out the person form, and then fetch or refetch the list of people. And then we're not really doing anything in the error state besides, setting our loading and errors, which useMutation takes care of for you. So don't really need to worry about that. And so then useMutation returns an object similar to useQuery. And I'll just call this create person. So, and create person has a few different attributes on it. So the first thing is, I'll just get rid of all this here, is called mutate. And so mutate is the function that actually triggers this this function that you first passed right here. So you call mutate, and then you pass it your object of variables. So we'll pass it the person form here. Yeah, so that is that's the mutate function. And then useMutation also returns things to keep track of the state that the mutation is in. So you can do create person dot is loading, so to check if the mutation is loading. And then you can do same thing, dot is error here to check if the mutation had an error. And then similar to with queries, it will store the error on an error attribute if there was one. So there is that. I think that was all the updates there. So we can get rid of these. We can get rid of these here for keeping track of that mutation state. And then just to make sure this still works correctly, we can create a person over here, and yep, everything works the same. So mutations are, definitely useful. I think they get a little bit more useful when, or I guess we'll talk about moving these to custom hooks here in a minute. So, but that's the basic API for mutations. It's a little bit less complicated than queries because there's a lot more to handle with queries. But yeah, so I think, let me look at my notes down here. Yeah, and then I wanted to over here also replace this delete person with the mutation. So person mutation here. We did before. We'll just pass it an object with the ID on it.
Boo boo, you're in the way.
So we'll pass it our mutation function, and then over here in our success handler, all we need to do is just reroute them to the home page. So do that right there, and then we can actually get rid of all of this. Delete person dot mutate, and then we'll pass it the person's ID. And then down here, delete person dot is loading, and same. So there we go. Then we can get rid of this, our state values right there. So I'll just make sure this works. We'll come back over here, click delete, and yep, that all works fine. So, so that is queries and mutations. That's kind of a basic introduction to React Query. And then just as kind of a last thing here, I wanted to show you how combining React Query with custom hooks makes this experience actually even better than it already is. So the first thing, I probably won't convert everything to custom hooks just so we don't run out of time. But first thing, just this people query. So, kind of like we talked about before, use query. I mean, it's obvious that we're using we're fetching some data, but we can actually make this a little bit better by extracting it to a custom hook. And there are a couple benefits that we'll see from doing this. So I usually like to put custom hooks over here in their own file. And I'll just call this use people. So we'll just use people there, and then we'll just take our query, put it over here, return that. So, it might seem kind of silly to create a custom hook that just wraps around this, but it actually is pretty useful for a couple of reasons that we'll get into here. So let me make sure that I imports over. And then we will just call our custom hook right here. So database config, yeah, I can show that here in a second after this. I'll remember that for here in a minute. So we've extracted this to a custom hook, and I mean, first thing is that it's pretty clear what we're doing here. We're using we're grabbing some people. And one nice thing about that we haven't really talked about with using functions is that the implementation of this can change. So if we decide we don't want to use React Query anymore, we want to fetch it a different way, we don't have to come in here and update our function. So it provides a nice interface that way. But another thing that's really nice about moving it to a custom hook is, you see here how we're taking these people and we have to pass everything down into our children components. And the reason we were doing that before was because we didn't want to overfetch, right? We didn't want to grab the people in the count component, but also in the list component. But with React Query, extracting it to a custom hook is actually all you need to do for this. So instead of doing this here, we can actually come right directly into our count and list components and just use our custom hook right here. Let me make sure this is imported. So get rid of these here. We actually don't need to pass them down anymore. Whoops. And then here we just need to change this people.error and then people.data. Is error right there. And then same thing down here. Message. And then people.data. People.data is there. So what's nice about this is that, we kind of get this Redux-esque functionality where we can just grab the data we need from the cache directly in our components where we need them, right? And I like that React Query kind of takes advantage of this natural pattern with React, which is custom hooks. So all it takes is just moving that to a custom hook, and then you can just use that hook wherever you need to use it. So we don't technically need it in this home component, so we can get rid of that, get rid of this, and you'll notice we still need to pass this refetch function to the form, and that's kind of the last thing I want to take care of here, which is converting that mutation to a custom hook. So up here in our form, we have this mutation here. And so I'm going to actually take this and extract that to a custom hook as well. Let's call it use create person. And then we will return this. And so we don't actually have access to the form over here, which is okay. And we don't have access to our fetch function anymore. But React Query also provides another hook for you to use that lets you grab the query client directly. So use query client. And so this will use the query client that we provided at the very beginning. And so then here in onSuccess, there's a function on the query client called Invalidate Queries. And so all we have to do is pass it the query key for the query that we want to invalidate. And what's nice about this is that you're now handing this over to React Query. So Invalidate Queries, all it does is it just marks that query as stale, and then React Query will trigger a background refetch. But you place that in React Query's hands now. So if React Query determines that other queries are maybe more important, it needs to refetch those first. It can take care of all that for you. So that takes care of that. And then this set person form. So because we've moved this to a custom hook, we don't have access to the form anymore. But that is actually okay. Make sure this is imported. So that's actually okay because on the mutate function, you can actually pass a another lit or another object of options here. So you can pass another on success handler where you reset the person form there. This is really nice because it allows you to decouple data things from UI things. So resetting the form is more of a UI task, so that makes sense for it to live here in the component. But refetching the data is more of a data thing, so we can move that portion of it over to the create person hook and just keep all data related things over here and keep all UI related things over here. So we actually don't need this. We can just call use our custom hook, use create person. And then we don't need to take this parameter anymore since we're just doing this all with custom hooks. So let's see, I think, I guess kind of going back, so I kind of talked about this, but I didn't show you. So you know how we moved that people fetch into the two different components. So we call it once on this component where we're displaying the list, and we call it once on this component where we're showing the count. So you notice that React Query keeps track of how many instances of this query are mounted on the page. So right now we have 2 instances. And React Query takes care of, deduping your requests for you. So even though you're calling this hook in 2 different places, it's actually not gonna, call refetch twice. It'll just do it once because, this query is marked with this unique query key, and it only stores that data one time in the cache, which is really awesome. It kind of, like I said before, it kind of lets you, it feels kind of like you're using Redux with the global store, even though you're just calling these custom hooks, which is awesome. Anyway, so I think that kind of brings me to the end here. So that's a basic introduction to custom hooks, React Query, and using them together. And I hope you found this informative and useful. I've personally found React Query and custom hooks to be, improve the quality of my React code a ton. And hopefully you'll find it does the same for you. So coming back over to my slides here, that's it. That's all I've got. If you want to follow me on Twitter, there's my handle. But yeah, I think that's all I've got. So I think that's everything. Coming back to this question in the chat here about the database config. Do you just mean where I'm calling, or where I'm connecting to the database? Since I'm using Next.js, it's kind of all here in this same project. So this is just, I'm using a Mongo database, just connecting to it right here. So yeah, I can publish this on a public repository, and maybe I'll just post it on my Twitter or something. So if you follow me there, then you can see where this code is hosted if you're curious in checking it out. So cool. Well,
Awesome.
I think that's everything. So
cool. Thanks, Zach. That was great. Can't wait to start using React Query a little bit more.
Yeah.
James
Shout out
Alden.
to the creator of React Query, Tanner Lindsley. Awesome.
Yeah.
Library that he's created there.
So what happened? How would you? Do you know, like, if you had an existing code base that was already, well into doing the things the normal way with Redux, like, how would you? Would it be easy to start kind of refactoring to use this instead?
Totally, yeah. We actually at work, we had a project that we were using Redux in, and I discovered React Query and, suggested we start switching over. And yeah, it's really easy to kind of do it incrementally. So you can just use React Query, in certain places, but keep your Redux. So it works really well that way. So
Nice. Awesome. Anyone else got any other questions? Just open up the floor. Cool. Yeah, and if you want to post anything like a link or to source code or something, feel free to put it in the Meetup page there in the chat section there.
Hey Zach, I have a quick question for you. Do you guys still use Redux for client-side state, or have you brought that into React Query as well? Because I think they have their own way of managing client-side state if you want to.
So since switching to React Query, we kind of discovered that most of what we were using Redux for was server state related things. And so there just wasn't really that much left over. So, I mean, it's kind of up to you at that point if you want to keep using Redux for your client state or not. If you have a lot of client state, maybe keep using it. But we didn't really have the need to. So, yeah. Any other questions?
Maybe not.
Cool.
I think your presentation was that good. Answered everyone's questions.
That good or that bad, I guess.
What's it like with like a real-time database? Is it have you tried it with that? Anything that's like real time?
No, I haven't tried it with that. So yeah, I can't really give an answer there.
I mean, React Query, right? It's always gonna basically mimic it's basically polling, right? So it's never going. You're always gonna, even if you were using some kind of real-time database, right? I mean, it's not like it's going to become where it's going to start pushing data. I mean, it's cool that you don't have to write that logic, right, to do that polling every time, like, all the magic that you get with React Query. I mean, that's awesome, the refetching and all that. But I don't know. I don't see how, no matter what database you're using, unless you were totally using WebSockets or something, something different that could be pushed onto the client.
Yeah.
Zach, have you used React Query against any GraphQL APIs too? Because I think it supports that.
Yeah. So React Query, anything that is promise-based, it supports. So yeah, that includes REST, that includes GraphQL. As long as that fetch function there returns a promise, then you can use it. And I haven't really compared it to like Apollo client. I haven't really used Apollo client, but I don't know. I've definitely heard about people that prefer React Query to Apollo client. I think so. I don't know. Maybe check it out for yourself if you.
I might have missed this in the talk too, but did you compare it at all to SWR?
Oh yeah. I personally have not, but React Query, I think here in the docs, they have, I know there's a page in here where he compares React Query to SWR. You have a whole list of the features. Let's see if I can find them here. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so comparison to SWR, Apollo Client, RTK Query. So list of features here. And it looks like, I mean, at least the list of features here, I mean, React Query supports a lot more than SWR does in some of these categories. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Of course, it works good with TypeScript. You see a TypeScript section there.
Yep. Yeah, you can use it with TypeScript.
So,
do you guys test your custom hooks with like the testing library hooks thing? You know what I'm talking about?
Like React testing library, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, that is what we've been using. So.
How's it been going?
Pretty good. I mean, we don't actually have a ton of tests written right now. When our app is kind of newish on testing. It's not a huge app, so we yeah, I don't actually have a ton of info on that, but yeah.
Okay.
cool. Well, if no one else has any questions, we'll wrap it up.